Hello, I'm Alexander. I have a new original story for you. Enjoy watching.
They chained her to the iron gate at dawn, and the whole village came to watch her die. They called it a mercy. They said it with their mouths full of bread, with their children on their shoulders, with the same hands that had once thrown stones at her back. A mercy. As if dragging a voiceless woman to the gate of the plague mask lord and leaving her there to rot was anything but the cruelest thing a frightened people had ever invented. Her name was Maren. Not that anyone had spoken it in years. The village had taken her voice when she was a girl, and after that they slowly took her name too, until she was only ever called the mute, the cursed thing, the one who never screamed even when she should have. She stood now with her wrists bound in cold iron, her bare feet in the frozen mud, and she did not scream. She had forgotten how. But her hands trembled, and that trembling was the only language she had left. Above her loomed the keep. Black stone, slick with mist, taller than anything the village had ever built, its windows like empty eye sockets, staring down at the crowd. For 3 generations, the people of the valley had told the same story to their children at night. Beyond that gate lived a man no living soul had ever seen unmasked. They called him the Plague Mask Lord, and they said his curse was so foul that to look upon his bare face was to wither where you stood, that the air around him carried rot, that he fed on the sickness of others to keep his own flesh from sloughing away. Every autumn the elders chose an offering, a beggar, a thief, a girl with no voice and no one to weep for her. They chained the offering to his gate, and by morning the offering was always gone. No bones, no blood, just gone. This year, the offering was Maren. The head elder, a thick-necked man named Corwin, who wore the council's silver chain across his chest like a trophy, stepped forward to address the crowd. He had a voice built for these moments, deep and rolling, the voice of a man who had spent his whole life convincing other people that his cruelty was their salvation. "The curse must be fed," Corwin announced, lifting his arms. "As it has always been fed. The Lord takes the rot of the world into himself, so that we may live free of it. We give him what the world doesn't want. We give him," he gestured at Maren without looking at her. "This?" The crowd murmured its approval. Somewhere a woman laughed. A boy threw a clump of frozen earth that struck Maren's shoulder, and she did not flinch, because flinching was a thing you did when you still believed someone might stop. Maren had stopped believing that a long time ago. If you have ever stood in a crowd that decided you were worth less than the dirt under their feet, then you already know the particular silence inside Maren's chest. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of someone who has screamed so long without sound that they have learned to fold the scream up small and carry it where no one can see. But here is the thing the elders did not know. Here is the thing the crowd, jeering and certain, could not have guessed. The Plague Mask Lord was watching, and he had been watching Maren for far longer than this morning. The great doors of the keep groaned open. The laughter died first. Then the murmuring. Then even the wind seemed to hold its breath, because out of the black mouth of the keep came the figure no one in 3 generations had ever seen move toward them. He was tall, draped in layered robes the color of old ash, and where his face should have been, there was the mask. You have heard of plague masks, those long-beaked horrors. But this was something older and stranger, a sculpted thing of darkened bronze and bone-pale leather, layered like the petals of some terrible flower, veil upon veil, each fold hiding the one beneath. No eyes were visible, no skin, only the slow, deliberate approach of a thing the village had spent its whole history teaching itself to fear. The crowd fell back as one body, trampling each other to retreat. Children were yanked behind skirts. Corwin himself took 3 quick steps backward before he remembered he was supposed to be brave, and froze with his silver chain glinting and his face the color of curdled milk. Maren did not move. She could not. She was chained. So she lifted her chin, the way she had taught herself to do at every beating, every banishment, every cruelty, lifting her chin not in defiance exactly, but in refusal. A refusal to look away. If this was the morning she died, she would meet it with open eyes. The masked lord stopped before her. He did not reach for her throat. He did not breathe rot upon her. He simply stood and tilted his masked head and looked down at her bound and trembling hands as though he were reading something written there. The crowd waited for the devouring. They had come for it. They had brought their children to learn the lesson of it. And then the Lord raised one gloved hand, not toward Maren, but toward his own mask. A gasp tore through the crowd. "My Lord, do not," Corwin started, his voice cracking. "The curse, the rot, it will spread. You'll kill us all." The Lord did not so much as turn his head toward the elder. With slow, ceremonial care, as though he had waited years for this exact moment, he hooked one finger beneath the outermost veil of the mask, the topmost ashen fold, and he lifted it. The crowd screamed and surged back. Several people fell. A mother covered her child's eyes. They were certain that what lay beneath would be horror, decay, the green-black ruin of a man eaten alive by his own curse. But Maren, chained, unable to flee, was the only one close enough to see what the lifted veil revealed. It was not rot. Beneath the first layer was not the slick gleam of disease, but skin. Ordinary skin, pale from years without sun, and across it a single old scar that ran from the edge of his jaw downward, the kind of scar left not by sickness, but by a blade. A wound, a human wound, long healed. Maren's breath caught. Because in all the stories, in all the warnings, in all the years of children chanting that the plague mask lord was a monster made of contagion, no one had ever once said the word that now hung silent and enormous between them. Man. He was a man. The Lord's voice came then, low and rough from disuse, pitched so quietly that only Maren could hear it over the panicking crowd. "They told you I would devour you," he said. "They have told that story for a long time. It is a useful story. It keeps people from asking what is truly behind the gate." He paused, and though she could not see his eyes, she felt them on her face like warmth. "You did not look away. Out of all of them, you are the only one who has ever looked at me and not run." Maren's hands shook against the iron. She could not answer with words. She had no words to give. But she did the only thing she could. She turned her trembling palms upward, the universal gesture of someone with nothing left to offer and nothing left to hide. And she let him see them. Something changed in the way he stood, a stillness, a recognition so sharp it was almost grief. "Those hands," he murmured. "I know those hands." Behind them, Corwin had recovered enough of his nerve to shout to the crowd. "It's a trick. The curse addles the mind. Look away, all of you, before it takes you too." But his voice had lost something. The certainty had cracked. And in the faces of the villagers, beneath the fear, a new and dangerous question had begun to form. If the Lord was not rotting, if the Lord was a man with a healed wound and a quiet voice, then what exactly had they been feeding to that gate every autumn for 3 generations? And why? The Lord reached down. The crowd flinched, but he only closed his gloved hand around the iron chain at Maren's wrists, and with a single sharp pull, the bolt that fastened her to the gate tore free of the stone as though it had been waiting decades to be released. "Not here," he said softly, to her alone. "What I have to show you cannot be shown in front of them. Come inside, and I will lift the rest. Every veil, every lie they built on top of me." He hesitated, and that hesitation was the most human thing of all. "I've waited a very long time to show someone the truth. I think I was waiting for you." Maren looked back once at the village, at Corwin clutching his silver chain, at the crowd that had come to watch her die, at the children who had been taught to throw stones. Then she looked at the open black doorway of the keep, and the masked man standing in it, like a question no one had ever dared to ask. And the woman they had thrown away, the woman with no voice and no name, made the first true choice of her life. She stepped through the gate. The door of the keep closed behind them with a sound, like a held breath finally released. And for the first time in her life, Maren stood somewhere the village could not reach her. Inside, the great hall was not the charnel pit the stories had promised. There were no piled bones, no rotting tapestries, no altar of skulls, where the curse-eaters of past autumns had supposedly been devoured. Instead, there was order. Clean stone floors swept smooth, tall windows of warped glass letting in pale gray light. A long table with a single chair, as though the man who lived here had spent a great many years eating alone. And everywhere, hanging on the walls in neat rows, were masks. Dozens of them. Plague masks with their long curved beaks, leather hoods, veils of dark gauze, iron half-faces fitted with hinges. An entire wall of faces he could wear, so that no one would ever see the one beneath. Maren turned slowly, taking it all in, and the masked lord watched her do it. "You are wondering," he said, "why a man would need so many ways to hide." He moved past her toward the table, his gloved fingers trailing the wood. "Every one of these was given to me by the elders. A gift, they called it. Every autumn, a new mask, so that the curse would stay contained, so that I would never frighten the children by accident, so that I would remember what I am." His voice tightened on the last words. They were very generous with their reminders. She wanted to ask the question burning in her chest, but she had no voice to ask it with. So she did what she had learned to do across a lifetime of silence. She pointed at the masks, then at his face, then she spread her empty hands wide. Why? Why all of this? He understood her at once. That was the thing that struck her most, even more than the bare human skin he had shown her at the gate. He understood her gestures the way other people understood speech, without effort, without the impatient squint everyone in the village had worn when she tried to make herself known. "Because the curse," he said quietly, "is not in me. It never was. He reached up and lifted the second layer of his mask, a panel of dark leather that had covered his jaw and throat, and let it fall away. Maren stepped closer despite herself. The skin beneath was scarred, yes, marked with the silvered lines of old burns that ran down his neck and disappeared beneath his collar. But it was not rot. It was not plague. It was the kind of scar a man carried out of a fire, the kind that healed long ago and only ached when the weather turned. "I was burned," he said. "The same night this village decided it needed a monster. 23 years ago there was a sickness here, a real one. It came up out of the low marsh water, where the elders had let the dead be buried too shallow, too close to the wells, because proper graves cost coin, and the council preferred to keep its coin. People began to die, and a frightened village always needs two things: someone to blame and someone to die in everyone else's place." Maren's hands had gone still. She was listening with her whole body now, the way the silenced learn to listen. "My family held this keep then," he went on. "We were wealthy. We were resented. And we were just far enough outside the village that no one would weep for us. So Corwin's father, the head elder before him, stood up in the square and told the people that the sickness was not the water. It was us. A curse, he said. A rot that lived in this bloodline and seeped down the hill into their homes. And the cure, he promised, was to wall the cursed family behind their own gate and feed the curse what it hungered for, so that it would stay up here and never come down to them again." He turned to face her fully. "They burned the keep that night with my family inside it. I was the only one who crawled out. A boy of 7, half burned, hidden in the cellar. And when the elders found me alive in the ashes the next morning, they did not finish me. They realized I was worth far more breathing." Maren shook her head slowly, not in disbelief, but in the dawning horror of understanding. "A dead monster ends the story," the Lord said. "A living one keeps it going forever. So they let me live, and they built the mask around me. They told the village the curse had taken my face, that I could never be looked upon, that each autumn the rot must be fed a soul, or it would spill down the hill and kill them all again. And every autumn, the village brought someone to this gate. Someone they would not miss. The lame, the strange, the voiceless." His eyes found hers. "Someone like you." A cold weight settled in Maren's stomach. She turned toward the wall of masks again, and now she understood why there were so many. One for every year. One for every soul that had been dragged up this hill, believing they were being given to a monster. She pressed her hand flat against her own chest, then gestured toward the gate, toward all the autumns before her, and made a small, desperate motion of digging. What happened to them? The others? For a long moment he did not answer. When he did, his voice had gone rough again. "Come," he said. "You ask the only question that matters. I will not lie to you the way they lied to everyone else." He led her through a low door at the back of the hall, down a corridor where the gray light gave way to the warmer glow of oil lamps. And Maren, who had spent her whole life being led places against her will, to the work she was given, to the corner where she slept, to the gate where she was meant to die, found that for the first time she was following someone because she chose to. Because she needed to know. Because somewhere in this scarred man's grief was an answer that touched her own buried life. They came to the second door, heavier than the first, banded with iron. He paused with his gloved hand upon it. "What I am about to show you," he said. "The elders would kill us both to keep hidden. Once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. You will carry it the way I have carried it for 23 years. He looked at her, and there was something almost pleading in the set of his shoulders. "I have wanted to show someone for so long that I have nearly forgotten how to be alone with it. But I will not force this on you. No one ever asked you what you wanted. So I am asking, do you want to see the truth?" No one had ever asked her that. Not once. Not what she wanted to eat, or where she wanted to sleep, or whether she wished to be sold to a monster at dawn. The village had decided her silence meant she had no wishes worth consulting. Maren looked at the iron door. She thought of the masks on the wall, each one a grave marker for someone the world had thrown away, just as it had thrown her away. She thought of the children who had been taught to throw stones, and of Corwin clutching his silver chain, and of the long, cold years in which no one had ever once turned their face toward her without contempt. Then she lifted her chin and she nodded. The Lord drew a breath and pushed the iron door open. Beyond it lay not a torture chamber, not a pit of bones, but a wide stone room lined with shelves, and on those shelves stood rows upon rows of small clay jars, each one sealed with wax and marked with a name. Hundreds of them. And in the center of the room, fed by a channel cut into the floor, ran a thin, dark stream of water that smelled faintly of iron and rot. Water that came down, she realized, from somewhere far beneath the village, from the same poisoned marsh the elders had buried their dead in all those years ago. "This," the Lord said softly, "is the real curse. The sickness never left Maren. It only went quiet. The elders sealed the bad wells and dug new ones and told the village the danger was gone because the monster had been fed. But the water still runs foul beneath these hills. And every autumn, when the sickness stirs again in the low season, they need the village frightened enough not to ask why people still cough blood in the winter months." He gestured at the rows of jars, his hand trembling. "So they bring me a soul, and the village calms itself, believing the curse is fed, and the elders keep their coin, and their power, and their secret." Maren walked slowly along the shelves, reading the names her whole body could barely contain. So many people swallowed by a lie. And then she stopped. Because on one of the jars, in faded letters, was a name she knew. A name she had not heard spoken aloud since she was a child. A name that belonged to the woman whose face she could only just remember. The woman who had once held her hands and hummed against her hair, before the village took her away and told a small, mute girl that her mother had simply died of the rot like everyone else. Maren's knees nearly gave out. The Lord was beside her in an instant, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Now you understand," he said, "why I knew your hands, why I have waited. You were not the only one they took something from that autumn. And I think," he hesitated, as though the words frightened him more than any mask ever had, "I think the reason they cut out your voice was so that you could never tell anyone what you saw the night they took her." Maren stood before the jar with her mother's name, and the room seemed to tilt beneath her. She reached out and touched the faded letters with 2 fingers, the way she had once touched her mother's face, in a memory she had spent her whole life trying to keep from dissolving. A small, sealed thing on a shelf. That was all they had left her. A name written in a stranger's hand, tucked between hundreds of other names, in a place no one in the village had ever been permitted to see. The Lord watched her with a stillness that was not coldness, but something closer to grief, held very carefully. "I did not know if you would ever stand in this room," he said. "For years, I told myself I would never bring anyone here, that it was kinder to let them die believing the lie than to show them the truth and send them back out into a world that would silence them for knowing it." He paused. "But you were already silenced. They could take nothing more from your voice. So I thought, perhaps you, at least, deserve to know what they did." Maren turned to him. Her hands were shaking and she did not try to hide it. She pressed her palm flat against her own chest, then opened her fingers outward toward him, a gesture she had used since childhood, a question shaped without sound. "Why? Why you? Why now?" He understood. He had spent 23 years reading the language of people who had no other way to be heard. "Because I was there," he said quietly, "the night they took your mother. I was a boy hidden in the dark, the boy they had already decided would become their monster. I watched from a gap in the cellar wall while they pulled her from her bed. And there was a child with her, a small girl who would not stop reaching for her mother's hands." His voice broke on the next word. "You reached for her. You did not scream, even then. You only reached." And one of the elders said, "That one sees too much." And another said, "Then make certain she never tells." Maren's knees did give out then. The Lord caught her before she struck the stone, lowering her gently until she knelt among the shadows of the jars, and he knelt with her, his ruined hands hovering near her shoulders, as though afraid that touching her might be one cruelty too many after a lifetime of them. She remembered, not all of it, but enough. The cold hands, the cloth pressed to her face, the taste of something bitter and burning at the back of her throat, and then the long silence that had never lifted. She had been told all her life that she had been born without a voice, a defect, a mark of the curse. They had built her shame so carefully that she had never once suspected the truth, that her silence was not a flaw she carried, but a wound they had inflicted. Something changed in her face. The grief was still there, but beneath it, slow and terrible, came anger. Not the small, swallowed anger of an outcast who has learned that which only earns more punishment. This was something larger. This was the anger of a person who has just discovered that the worst thing about her was never hers at all. The Lord saw it, and he did not flinch from it. If anything, something in his shoulders eased, as though he had been waiting a long time to see exactly that look on someone's face. "You feel it now," he murmured. "Good. Hold on to it. You will need it." He rose and offered her his scarred hand, and after a moment she took it and let him draw her to her feet. "Because the truth is not enough by itself, Maren. I have known the truth for 23 years, and it has changed nothing. They still come every autumn. They still bring me a soul. The truth locked inside this keep is just another grave. It has to be carried out. It has to be spoken where they cannot silence it." Maren looked at him sharply and lifted her hands again. She touched her own throat, then shook her head, a bitter, wordless gesture. How? How could she carry anything out when the one tool everyone else used had been cut from her years ago? The Lord was quiet for a moment. Then he led her out of the chamber of jars, back through the cold corridor, and into a smaller room she had not seen, a study, its walls lined with shelves, and on those shelves, not jars, but ledgers. Dozens of them, bound in cracked leather, their spines marked with years. They keep records, he said. The elders. They have always kept records, because men who profit from a lie are vain about their bookkeeping. Tariffs, tithes, the grain they take from each family in the name of feeding the monster. The coin they collect to pay for the binding rituals that do nothing. It is all here. I have been gathering it for years, pages smuggled out by the few servants brave enough to help me, copies made in the dark. He laid his hand flat on one of the ledgers. You do not need a voice to show a village a column of numbers, Maren. You do not need to speak to point at the names of the dead and the price each death earned the men who arranged it. For the first time since she had been chained to the gate at dawn, Maren felt something she did not have a word for, sound or no sound. It rose in her chest like warmth, returning to a frozen limb, painful and alive. It was not quite hope. It was closer to purpose. She walked to the shelves and ran her hand along the spines of the ledgers, and then she pulled one free and opened it and began to read. The Lord watched her, and he did not rush her. The candle on the desk guttered and steadied. Outside, far beyond the keep's thick walls, the village had not gone quiet. She could not hear it, but she could feel it, the low, restless tremor of a crowd that had watched their monster halt his own ritual and walk a condemned girl through his gate alive. That had never happened before. And in a place where everything depended on the story staying the same, even one broken pattern was a crack that could not be sealed. The Lord seemed to feel it too. He crossed to a narrow window and looked down, and his jaw tightened beneath the lower edge of the mask he still wore. They will not wait long, he said. Corwin is not a fool. He knows what it looks like, you walking in here and not dying. By morning, he will have a new story ready, that I have taken you, as the curse demanded, that your soul is being devoured slowly, that the village must stay away from the gate or share your fate. He turned back to her. He is very good at turning a problem into a warning. It is the only true skill he has. Maren set down the ledger and crossed to the window beside him. Below, in the gathering dusk, she could see the torches massing at the edge of the square, and the small, dark shape that could only be Corwin, his silver chain catching the light as he moved among the frightened, gesturing, soothing, rebuilding the lie one whisper at a time. She lifted her hand and pointed at him. Then she touched her chest. Then she pointed at the ledgers behind her. The meaning was unmistakable. Him. Me. These. Yes, the Lord said softly. Him. You. These. That is the whole of it. He hesitated, then added something he had clearly not meant to say aloud. I have spent my life learning to be feared, because being feared was the only safety they left me. But you, they gave you nothing. Not even fear. They threw you away as worthless, and you walked into the house of a monster with your chin up, the only soul who ever looked me in the eye instead of the mask. He shook his head slowly. I do not think you understand yet how dangerous that makes you to a man like Corwin. A frightened village, he can rule forever. But a village that sees a discarded girl stand unafraid in front of their monster and live, that village starts to wonder what else they have been told to fear for no reason. Maren held his gaze, and though she could not answer him with words, she answered him with the thing that frightened Corwin most. She did not look away. She nodded, slow and certain, and pressed her hand once more, flat against the cracked leather of the ledger, as if making a vow against it. But even as she did, a sound reached them through the window, not the murmur of the crowd now, but a single hard voice rising above it, calling the Lord's old, feared name into the dark. And beneath it, fainter, the dragging metallic rhythm of something being hauled toward the gate. The Lord went very still. He knew that sound. He had heard it every autumn for 23 years. "They are bringing another," he whispered, and the color drained from what little of his face she could see. "Corwin is not waiting until morning. He is going to feed the curse again tonight, in front of everyone, to prove the monster still hungers, to bury the question you raised before it can spread." He turned to her, and for the first time his composure cracked entirely. "And if I refuse to take them, he tells the village the curse is broken, and I am no longer their shield against the sickness. They will come for this keep with fire, and every truth in this room will burn with it." Maren looked from his stricken face to the torches gathering below, and she understood, all at once, that the time for reading ledgers in candlelight was over. Maren did not wait for him to decide. She was already moving, snatching the Lord's heavy cloak from the peg by the door and throwing it around her own shoulders, and the speed of it stopped him mid-breath. He understood, after a heartbeat, what she meant to do, and he caught her wrist, not hard, but firm enough to make her look up at him. "If you walk out that gate," he said, low and urgent, "they will see a discarded girl who walked into the monster's house and came out wearing his cloak. Corwin will say, 'I have made you my creature,' that the curse has claimed you, that you speak for death now. He will twist it." Maren held his gaze and shook her head slowly. Then she lifted both her hands, the trembling hands he had recognized at the gate that morning, and she pressed them flat against the cracked leather of the topmost ledger. She tapped it twice. She pointed at the window, at the gathering torches, and then she did something that made the breath catch in his throat. She mimed lifting a mask away from a face, his face, and she pointed at the crowd. "Show them," the gesture said, "not the cloak, the truth." For a long moment he only looked at her. "You want me to go out there unmasked," he murmured, "to stand in front of the people who have feared me for 23 years and let them see an ordinary man." His voice cracked on the last word, because she had named the one thing he had never once dared to do. The mask had been his armor, and his prison both. Without it, he was only a scarred man whom a frightened mob could burn as easily as any sacrifice. With it, he was the lie that kept the elders fed. She was asking him to surrender the only power the village had ever granted him, but she was also offering him something he had not held in 2 decades, a reason to stop hiding. Down at the gate, the torches had become a wall of fire. Corwin's voice rose over the murmuring, practiced and oily, the voice of a man who had buried 100 questions beneath ceremony. "People of the Hollow," he called, "the monster has tasted one offering, and still he hungers. See how the sickness lingers in our wells, in our children's lungs, because the curse is not yet satisfied. Tonight we give him what is owed, and the rot stays behind these iron gates, where it belongs." And then Maren saw who they had brought. It was a young woman, no older than 22, her wrists bound in the same rough rope that had bound Maren that morning, her bare feet bleeding on the frozen path. Maren knew her. Everyone in the Hollow knew her. It was Brega, the cooper's daughter, who had laughed too loudly at the wrong feast and asked just once, in the wrong company, why the wells near the elder houses ran clean while the poor folks' water came up brown. She had asked a question. That was her only crime. And now she was being dragged to the gate to die for it, exactly as Maren's mother had died for seeing too much. Something in Maren went very cold and very still. She had spent her whole life being moved by other hands, shoved, silenced, traded, chained. But she watched Brega stumble, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like a voice returning to her chest, that she would not stand in this hall and let it happen again. She turned to the Lord and pointed at the door. Now. He drew a breath that shook. Then he reached up, not to lift one veil, as he had done for her in private, but to unbind the entire mask from his head. His fingers found the iron clasps at the back, the ones no living soul in the village had ever seen undone. "If they burn us," he said quietly, "at least they will burn us looking at the truth." The mask came away in his hands, heavy and hollow, a thing of beaten iron and old fear. And for the first time in 23 years, the Plague Mask Lord walked toward his own gate with his face bare to the cold. The effect, when he stepped into the torchlight, was immediate and total. The crowd recoiled as one body, a gasp rippling backward through them like wind through wheat. They had braced themselves for horror, a rotting skull, a face of weeping sores, the death they had been promised. Instead, they saw a man, a tall, gaunt man with old burn scars along one cheek and tired, human eyes, his hair gone gray at the temples, his jaw set with something that was not hunger at all, but grief. He looked, more than anything, like one of them, like someone's son, like someone the village had wronged. Corwin's torch dipped. For one beautiful instant, the head elder had no script. "Stop," the Lord said. He did not roar it. He said it the way a man says a word he has held behind his teeth for half his life, and somehow that was louder than any roar. "Let the cooper's daughter go." The two men holding Brega hesitated, looking from the unmasked face to Corwin and back, the certainty draining out of them. Maren stepped forward then, into the torchlight beside the Lord, the great cloak pooling around her, and the crowd's eyes went to her, the mute girl they had thrown away at dawn, alive, unmarked, standing whole beside the thing they had fed her to, not rotted, not devoured, standing as though she belonged there. A woman near the front began to weep. An old man muttered a prayer and then stopped, confused, because the prayer had no place in what he was seeing. Corwin recovered the way snakes recover. "Sorcery," he hissed, lifting his voice for the crowd. He has glamored her, friends, glamored himself. Do not be fooled by a pretty mask of flesh over the rot beneath. The curse wears many faces. But Maren was already moving. She had the ledger clutched against her chest, and she crossed the frozen ground to the first row of villagers and thrust it open under the nearest lantern, jabbing her finger at the columns of cramped, damning ink. She could not say the words, so she made them read. Names, dates, sums. Tithe paid by the cooper, by the smith, by every poor household in the hollow, paid to the elders for protection against a curse, and beside each entry, in Corwin's own neat hand, a tally of grain and silver that had never once gone to fight any sickness. And lower, in a separate column she could not have invented, a list of the taken. One name each autumn, the expendables, the askers of questions, the seers of too much, her mother's name. And there, freshly added in wet ink, a single word waiting for its date. Brega. The cooper, Brega's own father, pushed forward and looked at the page. Maren watched his face change. She watched 20 years of obedient fear curdle into something else as he read his daughter's name, written down as a future corpse, before she had even reached the gate. "That is my Brega," he said hoarsely. "You wrote her name before tonight. You decided this. You." He turned on Corwin, and his voice broke open like a dropped jar. "You knew you were taking her. You wrote it down." The Lord's voice carried over the rising murmur, and now there was iron in it, the only iron he had left. "The sickness in your water is real," he told them. "Your children truly do cough blood some winters. But it doesn't come from me, and it never has. It comes from the burial pits the elders dug too shallow and too close to your wells 23 years ago, when they buried the first dead in a panic and then lied about where. The rot is in the ground beneath your feet. And every autumn, when too many sicken and the questions grow too loud, they hand you a monster to blame and a body to bury the question with. I am not your curse." He let the mask fall from his hand into the frost at his feet, where it landed with a dull, human clang. "I am only the man they chose to hide behind." For a moment, the whole hollow seemed to hang suspended, torches trembling, breath fogging the cold air. The crowd caught between the lie they had lived in and the truth bleeding out of every page Maren held. And in that suspended moment, Corwin did the thing that desperate men do when the ground gives way beneath them. He stopped arguing. His eyes went hard and flat, and he turned to the two largest men at his side, not villagers, Maren saw now, but the council's own hired hands, and he said, very quietly, the words that changed everything. "Take the girl, take the ledgers, and put the keep to the torch before they read another line." For one breathless instant after Corwin's order, the hollow did not move. The words hung in the cold air like smoke that refused to rise. "Take the girl, take the ledgers, burn the keep." And Maren felt them land in her chest, the way a stone lands in still water, rippling outward into something that could not be taken back. Then the two hired men lunged. They came for her first, because she held the truth in her hands, and a man like Corwin had always understood that the proof was more dangerous than the prophet. The larger of the two reached for the ledger, his fingers spread wide, and Maren did the only thing her body knew how to do after a lifetime of being grabbed in the dark. She twisted, clutching the heavy book against her ribs, and threw herself sideways into the crowd. But the crowd was no longer a wall of jeering strangers. It was the cooper and the cooper's wife, and the smith with soot still on his forearms, and Brega herself, half freed from her bindings, and they did not part to let the men through. They closed. The Lord moved faster than a man his age should have. He had spent 23 years carrying the weight of an iron mask, and the weight of a lie heavier still. And now, bare-faced and unburdened, he stepped between Maren and the nearest enforcer with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already decided he would not run again. He did not strike. He simply stood and let the torchlight fall full on his scarred, ordinary, grieving face, and said, loud enough for every soul in the hollow to hear, "Look at me. Look at the monster you were told to fear. I have stood at this gate for 23 autumns and devoured no one. The only thing that has ever eaten your children is the water Corwin told you to keep drinking." The enforcer hesitated. That hesitation was everything, because the men Corwin had hired were not monsters either. They were poor men from 2 villages over, paid in silver to stand and look frightening, and they had been told, as everyone had been told, that the thing behind the gate was a death-bringer who would rot them to the bone. They had braced themselves to seize a witch from the clutches of a demon. They had not braced themselves to seize a weeping woman clutching a book, while a scarred man with kind, tired eyes asked them to look at what they were doing. The larger man's hand fell open. The ledger stayed against Maren's ribs. Corwin saw the moment slipping, and did what cornered men always do. He raised his voice to drown the doubt. "She has bewitched you, all of you. The curse has crept into your minds through your ears. Seize them before you all rot." He snatched a torch from the bracket beside the gate and turned toward the keep itself, toward the open door behind which lay every jar, every name, every shred of evidence that could end him. "If you will not take it," he snarled, "I will burn it myself." And that was when Maren did the thing that no one, not Corwin, not the Lord, not even Maren herself an hour before, had thought she was capable of. She made a sound. Not a word. The cords for words had been taken from her long ago in a cold room, by men who decided a child who saw too much should never speak of it. But what rose out of her now was something older than words, and louder than any of them expected, a raw, cracked, furious cry torn straight from the ruined place in her throat, a sound like a door being forced on rusted hinges, a sound that said, "No," with everything she had left. It stopped Corwin's hand in the air. It stopped the whole hollow. Heads turned. Brega's father went pale. Because they had all been told the curse-eater was mute, was empty, was nothing, and here she was, screaming the only way the elders had left her able to scream, and the sound of it was unbearable precisely because they all suddenly understood why she could not form the words. The Lord seized the opening. He did not go for Corwin. He went for the torch. He crossed the frost in 3 long strides and closed his bare, scarred hand around the burning brand, around the flame itself, and Maren saw him flinch, saw the skin of his palm blacken, and saw him not let go. He wrenched the torch from Corwin's grip and drove it down into the wet earth at the gate, where it hissed and died, and the only light left was the cold, honest light of the lanterns the villagers carried. He stood there cradling his burned hand against his chest, and he looked at Corwin, and he said quietly, You will not hide it in ashes. They have already read it. You cannot unread a thing once it is in a person's eyes. Corwin's face, in that lantern light, finally showed the thing beneath the authority, not righteousness, not fear of any curse, but the small, cold panic of a man watching the source of his power drain into the mud. He looked at the cooper. He looked at the smith. He looked at the faces he had ruled for 2 decades through fear he had manufactured himself, and he saw them looking back at him the way a flock looks at a shepherd who has just been seen sharpening his knife. "You paid us," the cooper said slowly, the ledger's words still burning behind his eyes. "Every autumn, you took our grain and our silver to fight a sickness. And it says here," he jabbed a thick finger at the page Maren still held open. "It says here, the grain went to your storehouse, the silver to your house, and the sickness you never once tried to stop, because the sickness was the leash you kept us on." His voice broke. "My brega. You wrote my brega's name down like a debt to be collected." A low sound moved through the crowd then, not a roar, not yet, but something deeper and more frightening to a man like Corwin. The murmur of people doing arithmetic they had been forbidden to do, adding up the autumns, counting the names, remembering the faces of the taken, the question askers, the ones who had drunk the brown water and coughed and been told it was punishment for impiety. Remembering, every one of them, a mother or a brother or a child, laid in the cold ground while Corwin stood over the grave and named the curse and passed the collection bowl. Maren turned the page. There were more names. There were always more names. And she held the book higher into the light, so they could not look away from the arithmetic of their own grief. But Corwin had not survived 20 years as the most powerful man in the Hollow by losing gracefully. As the murmur rose, he did the last thing left to a man whose lie has died. He reached for a different fear. "Even if every word were true," he said, and his voice steadied into the smooth, reasonable tone that had soothed this village through 100 burials. "Even then, what would you have us do? The pits are real. The poison in the ground is real. He admits it himself." He pointed at the Lord. 23 years that rot has been in the earth, and not one of you knows how to draw it out. You can burn me at the stake tonight, and your wells will still run brown tomorrow. You can read every name in that book, and your children will still cough, blood come winter. I gave you a way to live with it. I gave you something to blame and someone to bury, and it kept you sane through every hard year. Tear that down, and what is left? An open grave under your feet, and no one to tell you how to climb out. And the terrible thing was that it worked. A little. Maren felt the crowd waver, because Corwin had found the one true thing inside his mountain of lies. The sickness was real, and fear of it had been the rope they all clung to. And a rope, even a rotten one, feels better than the dark when you are dangling over a pit. Several lanterns lowered. The cooper himself faltered, his rage tangling with the older, deeper terror of the water that had killed so many. If the Lord could not cure it, if no one could, then what was the truth worth except more nights lying awake listening to your children breathe? Maren watched the doubt creep back into their faces, and she understood, with a cold clarity, that exposing the lie was not enough. The village would not rise for the truth alone. They would only rise if the truth offered them something fear could not. A way out. And she turned, the ledger pressed to her chest, and looked at the Lord, at his burned hand, at his bare and waiting face. And in her eyes was a single fierce question that did not need a voice at all. Can it be stopped? Not proven. Not blamed. Stopped. The Lord met her gaze, and slowly, very slowly, something kindled behind his eyes that the village had never once seen there in 23 years. Not grief, not endurance, but the dangerous, fragile thing called hope. He looked at the dark mouth of the keep behind him, toward the hidden chamber and the foul underground stream, and toward something Maren had not yet seen. And he said, just loud enough for her to hear beneath the murmur of the crowd, "There is one more thing I never showed you. The reason I have stayed at this gate all these years, instead of fleeing. I did not stay to be their monster, Maren. I stayed because I have spent 23 years digging." 23 years digging. The words hung between them like a held breath, and for a heartbeat, Maren forgot the crowd, forgot Corwin's outstretched arm, forgot the men already turning toward the keep with torches in their fists. Digging. She turned the word over in her mind, the way she turned everything she could not speak, examining it from every side. A man feared as a monster, a man who could have fled across the mountains decades ago and lived out his days under a false name, far from the village that burned his family. He had stayed. He had stayed at this gate, year after year, accepting their masks and their hatred and their offerings, and the whole time he had been doing something none of them knew. Maren's eyes asked the question her mouth could not, and the Lord, even with Corwin's hired men closing in around them, answered it the only way he had left. He raised his burned hand toward the dark mouth of the keep behind him, not as a threat, as an invitation. Come and see. But Corwin had seen the hope kindle too, and he was a man who had built his entire life on smothering hope before it could spread. "Take them," he barked, and his voice cracked on the order in a way it never had in all the years he soothed the dying. "Take the woman, take the book, and burn the rest. Now, before they think too long." The two enforcers he kept, broad men paid in silver and silence, men who had dragged more than one autumn offering to this very gate, lunged forward. One reached for Maren's arm. The other swung a pitch torch toward the open door of the keep, where everything the Lord had hidden for 23 years waited in the dark. What happened next moved faster than the crowd could follow, and slower than Maren would ever forget. The Lord stepped between her and the reaching man with a speed that did not belong to the slow, stooped figure they had all imagined behind the mask. He caught the enforcer's wrist and twisted, and the man went to his knees in the mud with a sound that silenced the nearest onlookers. But the second man was already at the threshold, torch raised, and Maren saw in one cold flash what would be lost: the jars with their names, her mother's name, the ledgers, the proof, the only thing standing between this village and another century of buried lies. She did not think. She ran. She was small, and she was fast, and she had spent her whole life being overlooked, which meant she had spent her whole life learning to slip through gaps no one watched. She reached the doorway before the torch did. She did not try to fight the man. She could not have. He was twice her weight. But she did the one thing he did not expect from a thing the village called expendable. She planted herself in the doorway, between his fire and the dark, and she did not move. She lifted the ledger over her head, where every lantern in the square could see it, and she looked back at the crowd with her chin raised, and her meaning was as loud as any scream. If you burn this, you burn the truth, and you will have chosen it. The man hesitated. It was only a breath of hesitation, the flinch of a hired hand who suddenly realizes the whole village is watching him decide, but it was enough. Because the cooper, whose daughter Brega still stood half unbound at the gate, with the fresh ink of her own death date drying in that very book, the cooper roared and seized the torchman from behind. And then it was no longer two enforcers against a masked recluse and a silent woman. It was a village beginning, at last, to choose. Not all of them. Maren saw that clearly even in the chaos. Perhaps a third of the lanterns surged forward to help the cooper. Perhaps a third shrank back into the dark, unwilling to lift a hand either way. And a stubborn knot of them clustered close around Corwin, the families who had eaten well off his counsels, the ones whose sons carried his silver, the ones too deep in the lie to survive its unraveling. The square that had gathered to watch a sacrifice had become something else entirely, a fracture line, with the truth on one side and 23 years of comfortable fear on the other. Corwin felt the ground shifting beneath him and did what such men always do. He changed the story. "You see," he cried, wheeling toward the wavering middle, the frightened ones, the ones who had not yet chosen. "You see how the monster has bewitched her. She does his bidding now. She guards his lair. She has already begun to rot from the inside, and soon she will turn on her own neighbors." He pointed a shaking finger at Maren in the doorway. "That is what his touch does. That is what waits for all of you if you tear down the wall that has kept us safe. Look at her and tell me that is the face of a woman who is still one of us." And Maren, standing in the doorway with the ledger raised, understood the trap of it, because she could not answer. She could not stand forward and say, "I am still myself. I am not bewitched. I am only a woman who learned the truth." She had no voice to defend herself with, and Corwin knew it, had always known it, because he was one of the men who had taken it from her. He was using her silence as proof of the very curse he had invented. The cruelty of it landed in her chest like a stone. They had cut out her voice to bury one truth, and now they were using the wound itself as evidence for the next lie. But the Lord had crossed the square to stand beside her, and he had heard it too. And something in his bearing changed. The last softness went out of it, and what remained was not the gentleness he had shown her in the keep, but the cold, terrible patience of a man who had waited 2 decades for exactly this moment and would not let it slip. "You want them to look at her," he said, and though he did not raise his voice, it carried to the farthest edge of the square. "Then look at her. And while you look, listen, because I am going to tell you the one thing Corwin had spent his whole life making certain you never asked." He turned to the crowd, bare-faced, scarred, ordinary. "You have always wondered why the curse only ever takes the poor, the orphans, the widows with no one to speak for them, the girls whose mothers ask the wrong questions. You told yourselves the curse is hungry, and the gods are cruel, and that is simply how it falls. But a curse does not read the tax rolls. A curse does not check whose family can pay the autumn tithe to be spared. Only a man does that. Only a man chooses. A murmur moved through the crowd, low and dangerous, and Maren watched the wavering middle begin, finger by finger, to lower their raised torches. Ask yourselves, the Lord went on, and now he did turn back toward Corwin. In 23 years, how many of the council's own children were ever chained to this gate? How many of the families who sit on the high benches ever lost a daughter to my curse? Not one. Not a single one. The curse has never once been hungry for the rich. He let that settle, let it sink its teeth in. Because it was never a curse that chose. It was him. And he chose the ones no one would miss, the ones with no voice to cry out. And when one of them had a voice, he made certain to take it. Every eye in the square turned, slowly, toward Maren. And this time it was not the look they had always given her, the flinch, the disgust, the careful blindness of people who had decided long ago that she did not count. This time it was something worse for Corwin, and better for her than she had ever dared hope. It was the look of people doing arithmetic, counting the years, counting the dead, counting whose children had survived every autumn and whose had not. Corwin's face had gone the color of ash. Lies, he managed, but the word came out thin, and a thin word is a fatal thing for a man whose entire power had always lived in the weight of his voice. He twists everything. He is a creature of, "My mother's name is in this book." The words did not come from Maren. They could not. They came from a woman near the front of the crowd, gray-haired, her hand pressed to her mouth, who had pushed close enough to read the open page Maren still held aloft. "My mother. Taken the autumn I was 9. You told us the curse called her." The woman's voice rose, shaken. "It's here, in ink, with a price beside it. 3 silver. You sold my mother for 3 silver and told me the gods were angry." And that, not the Lord's words, not Maren's defiance, but one ordinary woman reading one ordinary name in a ledger, was the thing that broke the dam. Because suddenly it was not a feud between a masked stranger and the council. It was every family in that square wondering whose name was written on the pages they could not yet see, and what price had been set beside it, and which of the men who had comforted them at the graveside had pocketed the coin. Corwin saw it break, and cornered men, Maren was learning, are the most dangerous of all, because they have nothing left to protect but themselves. He stopped arguing. He stopped performing. He turned to the knot of loyal families still clustered at his side, the ones too compromised to abandon him, and he said something low and fast that Maren could not hear. And then 6 of them peeled away from the crowd and began moving, not toward the keep, not toward Maren, but toward the dark path that led up the hill, toward the wells, toward the place where, the Lord had said, the poisoned burial pits still seeped their slow death into the village's water. And Maren felt the cold understanding bloom in her chest before she could even name it. Corwin had lost the crowd. So now he would do the only thing left to a man who could no longer rule the village. He would make certain that if the truth came out, there would be no village left to learn it. The Lord saw the men moving too, and the blood drained from his scarred face. "No," he breathed. "He wouldn't." But he stopped, because of course Corwin would. A man who had sold children for 3 silver would not balk at poisoning a well. "Maren," the Lord said, and his hand closed around hers, urgent now, all his careful patience gone. "The thing I have been digging, the reason I stayed, it is up that hill, and if they reach it before we do, every drop of water in this valley goes from slow poison to fast." He looked at her, and in his eyes was the question that had bound them from the first moment at the gate, the question of whether the girl the village threw away would run toward the danger or away from it. "Will you come? Not as a sacrifice, as the only person here I would trust with what I've hidden." And Maren, who had been chained to this gate at dawn to die, who had no voice and no name, and no one in all the world, looked up the dark hill, where 6 men carried torches toward the wells, and she ran first. The hill was steeper than it looked from the square, and the cold bit at Maren's lungs as she climbed, but she did not slow. Behind her, she could hear the Lord's boots striking the frozen earth, and behind him, fainter, the rising voices of a village that had finally begun to choose. Ahead, the 6 torches bobbed like 6 stars through the bare trees, climbing toward the old wells, where the village drew the water it gave its children. Maren had drunk from those wells her whole life. So had her mother. So had every soul who had ever stood in that square and called her cursed, without once wondering why so many of them buried someone every autumn. She understood now, climbing, that Corwin's cruelty had never been the worst of it. The worst of it was how ordinary the lie had been. How easy. A frightened village will believe anything that lets it keep drinking the water it cannot live without. The Lord caught up to her at the ridge, his bare, scarred face white in the moonlight, and he caught her sleeve and pulled her low behind a fall of stones. There, he breathed. Below them, in a hollow ringed by the old wellheads, the 6 men had stopped. They were not carrying water, Maren saw. They were carrying barrels. Squat, sealed barrels of the kind the tanners used, the kind that held the foul lie and the rendered poisons of their trade, and they were rolling them toward the open mouth of the deepest well, the one that fed half the village. Maren's blood turned to ice. Slow poison was one thing. A village could be warned, could be saved, could dig new wells and bury the old. But this would empty every cup in the valley before the truth could travel from house to house. This was Corwin choosing to drown the question in graves. The Lord pressed something into her hands. The ledger. The real one. The smuggled one. The years of names and coin. "If I don't come back down," he said very quietly, "you take this to the cooper. He will believe you now. They all will." And Maren understood that he meant to go down into that hollow alone, 6 men against one unmasked stranger, and she felt the old, helpless silence rise in her throat, like a drowning, the silence that had been cut into her, so she could never warn anyone of anything. But she was not that silenced girl anymore. She had walked through the iron gate and lived. She had forced a village to read its own sins by lantern light. And she would not stand on a ridge and watch the only person who had ever called her worth something walk into 6 torches and die. So she did the one thing they had never been able to take from her. She found the great iron bell rope of the well watch, the rope hung generations ago to warn of fire on the hill, and she seized it in both scarred hands, and she pulled. The bell broke open the night like a scream she had never been allowed to make. Huge, brazen, ringing down the hill and across the rooftops, and into every frightened ear in the square below. She could not shout. So she rang. She rang until her arms burned, until the men in the hollow spun with their torches lifted, until the whole valley knew that something on the hill was wrong. The Lord turned to her, and across his ruined face went something she had no word for. Pride, or grief, or love, or all three braided together. "They'll come now," he whispered. "You've made certain they'll come." Below, Corwin's men froze, caught between their barrels and the bell. One of them dropped his torch and ran. Two others kept rolling, desperate, knowing the village was already waking. And down in the square, Maren heard it, the cooper's voice, hoarse and furious, lifting the crowd that had stood paralyzed only minutes before. "The wells!" he was roaring. "They're at the wells! Brega! Lanterns! Everyone! The wells!" The tide of the village began to climb the hill. The Lord rose from behind the stones, and Maren rose with him, and together they came down into the hollow as the first barrel reached the lip of the deepest well. He moved faster than she had ever seen a man move, slamming his shoulder into the man who pushed it, sending both of them sprawling across the frozen ground, while the barrel rocked and held, half-tipped over the black water. Maren ran for it. She threw herself against the cold wood, her whole small weight set against the poison, her feet skidding, her arms screaming, and for one terrible heartbeat, it leaned the wrong way, toward the dark, toward the deep. Then hands closed beside hers, not the Lord's, a stranger's, Brega's. The cooper's daughter had reached the hollow first of all the climbing village, and she set her broad, cooper-trained hands beside Maren's, and together they hauled the barrel back from the edge and let it crash, harmless onto the stones. More villagers poured over the ridge. The torchlight that had meant murder a moment ago was drowned in the honest lantern light of 100 people who had finally come up the hill to see for themselves. Corwin's hired men scattered into the trees, and in the center of it all stood the unmasked Lord, breathing hard, and the mute bride, who could not speak a single word, and yet had rung a bell that brought a village back from the brink of its own grave. But Corwin himself was not among the men in the hollow. Maren turned, scanning the dark tree line, the cold understanding blooming in her chest again. He had not come to the wells. He had sent his men to do the drowning while he went elsewhere. And then she saw it. Far down the slope, low and orange and growing, a light that did not belong to any lantern. The keep. Corwin had gone to the keep, and the keep was beginning to burn, with every jar and every name and every shred of proof still inside its walls. The Lord saw it the same moment she did, and the blood left his face entirely. "The chamber," he breathed, "the proof, everything we have." He did not finish. He only looked at Maren, and once again the whole night narrowed to the question that had bound them since the gate: whether the girl the village threw away would run toward the fire or away from it. And Maren, who had just learned that her silence could ring like a bell, turned from the rescued wells and ran down the dark hill toward the burning keep, faster than she had ever run in her life. The heat reached her before the door did. By the time Maren's boots hit the flat stones of the keep's forecourt, the lower windows were already breathing orange, and a sound she had never heard a building make came rolling out of the old hall, a deep, hungry roar, like something alive feeding on the years stacked inside those walls. The Lord caught up to her at the threshold, and for one instant, they both stopped, staring at the doorway they had walked through together only days ago. Smoke poured out of it now in a thick black tongue, and somewhere far inside, behind that smoke, lay the hidden iron-doored chamber that held every jar, every name, every line of ledger ink they had bled to gather. Corwin stood in the courtyard with a torch still smoking in his hand, and he was not running. That was the thing that frightened Maren most, that he had not even tried to flee. He turned to face them with the calm of a man who had already decided he had won. Soot on his sleeves, his old eyes glittering in the firelight. "Let it burn," he said, almost gently, as if soothing a child. "There is nothing in there but paper and grief. Without it, you have a madman in a melted mask and a girl who cannot say a single word. Who do you imagine they will believe in the morning?" The Lord started toward him, and Maren saw murder rise in his unmasked face. 23 years of it. All the names, all the silence, all the autumns. But Corwin lifted the torch higher, toward the dry timber of the gatehouse, and the threat was plain. "Come at me, and I will set the whole hill alight, you among it." The Lord froze, caught between the man he hated and the proof dying behind him, and in that frozen breath, Maren understood that Corwin had built this trap as carefully as all the others. He had counted on the Lord's rage. He had counted on the Lord choosing vengeance over evidence, so that either way the truth would burn. So Maren did the thing he had not counted on. She did not go for Corwin. She ran for the fire. The Lord shouted. She heard her own non-name in it, the sound he had made for her, raw with terror. But she was already through the smoken doorway, low, her sleeve pressed over her mouth, into a hall gone amber and roaring. The masks on the walls were curling in their frames, the wood blistering. The long table she remembered already a line of flame. She kept to the floor where the air was still thin and cool, crawling toward the back passage, toward the iron door, her eyes streaming, her lungs fighting her. She had spent her whole life being told her body was worth nothing, expendable, a thing to be handed away. Now she spent it on purpose, and the choosing of it felt like the first thing that had ever truly belonged to her. The iron door was hot to the touch, but the chamber behind it had not yet caught. The stone walls and the heavy door had held the fire out a little longer. Inside, the jars sat in their patient rows, hundreds of names in the dark. She could not carry them all. She knew that the instant she saw them, and the knowing broke something in her, because each jar was a person, was someone's mother, was her mother. But she could carry the ledgers. She seized the bound stacks they had hidden there, the originals, the smuggled years of Corwin's own hand condemning himself, and she wrapped them in her shawl and clutched them to her chest like an infant. When she turned back, the doorway was a wall of fire. The passage she had crawled through was gone, swallowed. Heat slammed against her like a fist. She backed into the chamber, the precious bundle crushed against her, and for the first time since the gate, she felt the old animal certainty that she was going to die here, alone, unheard, exactly the way they had always meant her to. The smoke thickened. Her knees began to fold. Then a shape came through the flame. He had wrapped himself in the sodden horse blanket from the trough and thrown himself through the burning passage after her. And now the Lord stood in the chamber doorway, his bare, scarred face lit red, his arms already reaching. He did not speak. He pulled the wet blanket around them both, around her and the ledgers, and he put his body between her and the fire, and together they went back into the roaring throat of the hall, through the heat, through the curling masks, through 23 years of his imprisonment, turning to ash around them, and out at last, into the cold and the screaming crowd and the merciful, terrible night air. They fell together onto the frozen stones, coughing, blackened, alive, and the bundle in Maren's arms was whole, singed at its edges, smelling of smoke, but whole, every page of Corwin's guilt still legible. The villagers had come down from the wells. They stood in a great ragged ring in the firelight, and they had seen it. The girl they had thrown away running into fire to save the truth, and the monster they had feared carrying her out of it with his own body. Corwin saw the faces around him change. He saw the torch in his hand become, suddenly, not a weapon, but a confession. And as the Cooper stepped forward, and then Brega, and then a dozen others, closing slowly inward, the head elder began, for the very first time in Maren's memory, to back away. But the night was not finished with them. From the high dark above the wells came a new sound, horses, many of them, and the cold ring of armed men. Corwin had sent for more than hired locals. He had sent, days ago, to the magistrate of the river towns, who shared in his autumn profits, and now their riders were coming down the hill with torches and steel. And the Cooper's voice rose in warning over the crackle of the dying keep. The truth was saved. But the men who had grown rich on the lie were arriving to bury it. And Maren, clutching the ledgers to her scorched chest, lifted her streaming eyes to the Lord's and saw him understand the same thing she did. This was no longer their village's reckoning alone. The riders came down the hill like a black tide, torches streaming, hooves throwing up the frozen earth in clods. At their head rode a man in a fur-collared cloak, fat with comfort, his face the smooth, well-fed face of someone who had grown rich while the village dug its own graves. This was the magistrate of the river towns, and he had not ridden through the cold for justice. He had ridden to bury it. Maren felt the Lord's arm tighten around her shoulders. He was burned, exhausted, swaying on his feet, and the keep that had been his prison and his shield for 23 years was a roaring ruin behind them. Against 12 armed riders, they had nothing. Nothing but a singed bundle of ledgers and a village that an hour ago had wanted them dead. The magistrate reined in before the crowd and looked down at them with the boredom of a man certain of his power. "There has been a fire," he said smoothly, "and wild rumors. My men will take charge of any documents, restore order, and remove the dangerous individuals responsible." His eyes flicked to Maren, to the bundle she clutched. "Hand over the papers, girl, and no one else need be hurt tonight." And Maren understood, in that frozen breath, that this was the real test. Not the fire. Not Corwin. This man had silenced more villages than one. He counted on fear, on the old reflex of poor people lowering their eyes and stepping back. So Maren did not step back. She stepped forward. She walked out alone into the space between the crowd and the horses, a small, soot-blackened figure with no voice, and she lifted the ledger high over her head so every torch could light it. Then she turned, slowly, showing it to the villagers, not the magistrate, the villagers. And she pointed at the cover, at the seal pressed into its wax. The river town seal. The magistrate's own mark on the book that recorded the bribes paid to him every autumn for looking away. The cooper saw it first. That's his seal, he breathed. His seal is in the book of the dead. The words moved through the crowd like fire through dry grass. His seal, he's in it. He's named. The magistrate's smooth face cracked. "Seize her," he snapped, and his men spurred forward, but the village had already closed around Maren like a fist. The cooper, Brega, the well-watchers with their staves, the mothers who had lost children to the autumn lie. They did not scatter this time. They stood, a wall of the living, between the riders and the girl who had run into fire for the truth. A mounted man swung his torch down at the cooper. The Lord caught the blow on his own forearm and dragged the rider from the saddle, and then the whole hillside was moving, the villagers surging, hands seizing bridles, voices roaring 23 years of grief into the cold. The magistrate wheeled his horse to flee and found Corwin's own terrified hired men, sensing the tide had turned, blocking his path to beg for mercy they would not get. He was pulled down into the crowd he had bled for a lifetime, and the night swallowed his shouting. By the time the sky paled, it was over. They did not burn or hang anyone. Maren would not allow it, and the Lord stood with her, and somehow that mattered now. Corwin and the magistrate were bound and held for the king's circuit judge, who came 11 days later and read every page of the ledgers aloud in the village square, until grown men wept and the powerful men's faces went gray. The poisoned burial pits were dug out that spring, the foul stream sealed with clay and lime, clean water carried down from the high springs in a channel the whole village built together with their hands. People stopped dying in the autumn. They simply stopped. And the masks came down, all of them. The villagers took the dozens of iron masks from the ashes of the keep and laid them in a single grave on the hill, one for every soul the lie had eaten, and they carved the names into a long stone. Maren's mother's name was first. Maren set her hand on the cold letters for a long time, and for the first time in her life, her grief had somewhere to rest. The Lord found her there as the sun came up. He was not a lord anymore. Not really. Just a scarred, quiet man named Thomas, which was the name his mother had given him before the village took everything else. He stood beside her, bare-faced in the daylight he had hidden from for half his life, and he told her, at last, the thing he had been carrying. "The night they took your mother," he said softly, "I was a boy hiding in the rafters, and I saw you, a little girl who would not look away, even when they made you. I have remembered your eyes for 23 years. When they chained you to my gate, I thought the world had finally sent me the one person who might understand. I did not unmask for the crowd, Maren. I never would have. I unmasked because it was you." Maren could not speak. She would never speak. That had been taken and would not come back. But she lifted her hands, the trembling hands he had recognized at the gate, and she signed, slowly, the gesture she had made to no one in years, because no one had ever waited long enough to learn it. "Thank you for seeing me." And he, who had learned to read silence better than any man alive, understood every word. They did not need a wedding or a crown. She stayed because she chose to, and he asked her every single day what she wanted, and listened with his whole body to her answer. The village that had thrown her away learned, slowly, painfully, to call her by the name she finally chose for herself, and they spoke it gently, the way you speak the name of someone who saved you. If you've ever felt invisible, silenced, overlooked, thrown away by the very people who should have protected you, then you already understand why Maren rang that bell, and why the man behind the mask waited a lifetime for the one person who refused to look away. If her story moved you, if it gave you chills, take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters, even when the world tries to take it. And subscribe for more emotional tales like this one. Tell me in the comments, would you have stepped forward like Maren did, or stepped back? I read every single one. Thank you for staying until the very end.